Small disclaimer, this is my first discussion video, so please bear with me if it's sloppy. So I've got a list of the most important Fire Emblem characters in Smash Ultimate. We currently have 8 Fire Emblem characters in this game. To name them all in order of release, that's Marth, Roy, Ike, Lucina, Robin, Corrin, Chrom, and Byleth. That's a lot.
But wait, don't Mario and Pokemon have a lot of characters in Smash?
Well yeah, they both have 8 characters each. Well actually there's 11 Pokemon in the game, but 3 of them are used by the Pokemon trainer. So why is it a problem for Fire Emblem to be on par with Mario and Pokemon? To keep it simple, Fire Emblem isn't nearly as popular around the world as Mario and Pokemon are. I mean, ask your grandma who Mario, Pikachu, and Marth are. She'll probably recognize the first 2, but then she'll ask who the blue-haired twink is. Before we go on to discuss the main topic, I'd like to discuss a few other things. Personally, I think that after a franchise has been chosen to be in Smash, the character chosen from that franchise, most importantly, has to represent their franchise pretty well. Also, they should have interesting potential as a fighter, and being popular helps too. Let's examine 4 characters. Incineroar, Daisy, the Villegas, however you pronounce that, and Twintel. Let's start with Incineroar. Incineroar is the final evolution of Litten, one of the starter Pokemon in Pokemon Sun and Moon, so he represents those games just about as well as Decidueye, the final evolution of Rowlet, another one of those starters. See, at first, Decidueye was considered for Smash Ultimate, but ultimately Incineroar was picked instead. Not only is Incineroar quite popular, but he's also got more unique potential as a fighter compared to Decidueye, an archer, considering we already have archers in Smash, whilst Incineroar is our first wrestler. Next, let's move on to Daisy. Daisy got added to Smash Ultimate, and I think it's because she's become more popular recently. Waluigi has also become more popular recently, but Daisy was just easier to code in considering her similarities to Peach. Next, Villegas. Villegas are the Pyra and Mithra duo from Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Whilst Rex is the main character of that game, I think it goes without saying that the girls are more popular than Rex. On top of that, it's just more interesting to play as a character that can swap forms rather than a guy that swapped swords. We've discussed Incineroar, Daisy, and Villegas. But Twintel is the odd one out here, because she's the only one that isn't in Smash. A lot of people think she should have been the representative for ARMS instead of Min Min, and as someone with my fair share of time playing ARMS, I completely disagree. I think this is obvious, but a core component of the ARMS franchise is playing as characters with long arms, of course. Twintel is the only character from that game that doesn't use her arms, but her hair instead. I think it's better to represent ARMS with a character that uses their arms. Maybe if we got a second character from ARMS in Smash, it could be Twintel. But considering the way that Sakurai and the Smash devs handled their first ARMS character, you guys do not want another ARMS character in this game. Trust me. But that's a video for another day. On top of that, Twintel can slow down time at will, which is more ridiculous than Bayonetta's Witch Time ability. She's already a bigger threat than Min Min in ARMS, now imagine if she wasn't Smash. Now that we've discussed their characters should represent their franchise well, be an interesting fighter, and also be popular, let's discuss my list of the most important Fire Emblem characters in Smash. Where better to start than with Marth? Marth is essentially the figurehead of Fire Emblem. He was the first protagonist, and Sakurai enjoys referencing a franchise's roots. His gameplay encourages players to familiarize themselves with the full length of Marth's sword, because he deals more damage when the tip of his sword hits its opponent. Roy is evidently similar to Marth, but with fire. Opposite to Marth's tip gimmick, Roy has a hilt gimmick, where his attacks deal more damage when the hilt of his sword hits its opponent. His attacks have become more distinguished from Marth's in more recent Smash games, but the similarities are still evident. Ike is more of an opposite to Marth, being slow and fairly heavy instead of being a fast and slippery midweight. Marth focuses on precise range, and Roy focuses on up-close aggression. Ike can kinda just swing and get kills, but his heavier weight and riskier recovery makes him much harder to play when he's off stage compared to Marth. Smash 4 came in and introduced 3 more Fire Emblem characters on top of the 3 that we already had. Lucina is Marth, but without the tipper gimmick. That's it. I genuinely don't have anything else to say about her. Now, this bit's important. Remember earlier how I mentioned that one of the core components of ARMS is playing as characters with long arms? Well, the Fire Emblem franchise has multiple core components, but 3 of them revolve around swords, magic, and dragons. While Marth initially came in to represent the sword part of Fire Emblem that Roy, Ike, and Lucina came to represent too, Robin represents the magic part of Fire Emblem, and he also wields a sword. He's the only Fire Emblem character in this game that uses tomes, which are basically magic books. He has a unique resource system that honestly some other characters could have used to some degree. Corrin was the third Fire Emblem character to be added in Smash 4, totaling to 6, which many people thought was too much for Fire Emblem. Honestly, I do understand the complaints. That's why we're here. However, unlike any other character, Corrin represents the dragon part of Fire Emblem. He can transform parts of his body into abstract weapons, and also fully transform into a dragon. Chrom was added into Smash Ultimate as the 7th Fire Emblem character, and what was considered to be an Echo Fighter. He's an Echo Fighter of Roy specifically, so he's very similar. However, unlike some Echo Fighters, he at least has one different move from the character he was copying. Byleth was the 8th and final Fire Emblem character to be added into Smash Ultimate, and he represents another aspect of Fire Emblem, the weapon triangle. Ironically, the 4 weapons he uses specifically in Smash can't be used at all, besides the sword. So, with every Fire Emblem character in Smash touched upon, who would I remove from Smash first? Who's the least important character on this list? If it wasn't obvious already, the first character I would remove is Lucina. Sorry Lucina fans, she's one of the 3 characters from Fire Emblem Awakening, which is pretty unnecessary. For those who don't know, there's a lot of Fire Emblem games with different protagonists, roughly 15 mainline games at the time of Smash Ultimate's release. Out of 15 games, one of those games had 3 characters put in Smash. Out of 8 characters, 3 of them came from the same game. I just want those numbers to be clear to you. I mean, sure, Awakening is considered the game that saved the franchise, making the franchise more popular after Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn failed to sell well. But 3 characters from one game out of 15 games is simply too much. Many people, such as myself, prefer other areas of Fire Emblem, and also most franchises in Smash don't even have half of the amount of characters that Fire Emblem does. I mean really, if your defense is that Awakening sold well, would that mean 3 houses deserve to have 4 characters in Smash considering it sold better than Awakening? I'd also like to clarify that whilst Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn didn't sell very well, Ike, the main protagonist from both of those games, is the most popular character in all of Fire Emblem.
But what about the other Fire Emblem Awakening characters? Why not remove Chrom or Robin?
Let's discuss Fire Emblem Awakening. We'll get back to Smash, don't worry. So, in terms of the main focus of the story, Chrom and Robin are more important than Lucina. While she is important in helping Chrom, the point is, well, that she's helping Chrom. He's the leader of the army that you use. Robin, on the other hand, is integral to the plot of the game, with multiple reasons I can't fully get into without completely spoiling it, but it's also worth mentioning that Robin is the avatar for the player. He's the character that you follow the most alongside Chrom. You can also customize him. Now let's talk about Smash Ultimate again. Once again, Robin is the most important character here. He's the only character that represents the magic side of Fire Emblem, so we can't get rid of him. Chrom and Lucina are both Echo Fighters of characters that are already in Smash. But unlike Lucina, Chrom has a move borrowed from another character. To be more specific, he's borrowed Ike's up B, Aether. Funny enough, this didn't originate from Smash. He actually borrowed this move from Ike all the way back in Fire Emblem Awakening. It looks like this. Not what you were expecting, huh? There's also some nuances in the way that Chrom is different from Roy that doesn't match up to how Lucina is different from Marth. In Smash, focusing on spacing your attacks for the sake of safety is important, and Marth incentivizes that really well, while Roy rebels against that really well. With both Marth and Lucina, they can both focus on spacing their attacks. With Roy and Chrom, however, Chrom is allowed to focus on spacing his attacks, whilst Roy really shouldn't. In other words, whether you're playing Marth or Lucina, you can play pretty much the same, the main difference really being the character's consistency, whereas there's actual gameplay differences between Roy and Chrom. That creates a really nice dichotomy between them. While Marth and Lucina have a very weak dichotomy, both doing very similar things. Lucina is just, well, milquetoast Marth. Yes, that's one word, it took me a while to believe that too. Now that I've made my long case on why Lucina should be the first to leave Smash, who'd be next? Well, it's her dad. I've already gone over how Chrom is the second most important character of this trio in Awakening, and I've also mentioned that Chrom is an Echo Fighter of Roy. making him feel less original than other sorties, apart from Lucina, of course. But also, I believe that since there are at least 15 mainline Fire Emblem games, no single Fire Emblem game should have multiple characters in Smash. So between Chrom and Robin, Chrom is the obvious choice to toss away. Do I think that Chrom is lame? No, not really. In fact, I think he's one of the most interesting and cool Fire Emblem characters to watch on screen. But in terms of the actual ideas that the character has, he's not very interesting. What does any of that mean? Well, he moves quickly and he swings his sword pretty quickly too, which makes him interesting to watch and kind of interesting to play too. But he's also just swinging his sword. Also, I initially thought it was quite strange to just throw Chrom into Smash Ultimate the way that he was. Hardly any fanfare, no animated trailer, he just showed up as a newcomer. I just think that between the two Awakening characters, of which there shouldn't be two, Robin is a better representative for the Fire Emblem franchise over Chrom. Robin just has more to him. Sure, most people don't think he's as interesting to watch as Chrom, and I do kind of understand that sentiment, but Robin uses magic, uses his swords, and he's a much more strategic character than Chrom. Given that Fire Emblem is typically seen as a series of strategy games, it just makes sense. So, with Lucina and Chrom gone, who's next? This is probably where things will start to get controversial, if they haven't already. I think the next Fire Emblem character to leave Smash should be Roy. I know, he's cool too, he's cool just like Chrom. And personally, I do like the element of fire, probably my favorite element in RPGs. Out of all of the Fire Emblem characters in this game, Roy is one of the characters I'm the most interested in playing. So why do I think that Roy is the third least important Fire Emblem character in this game? Well, once again it comes down to him being a less interesting fighter in terms of the actual ideas he presents. Is he fast? Yeah. Does he swing a sword fast? Yeah. Does he have interesting concepts? Not really, just like Chrom. Maybe if something more was done with the whole fire element, Roy would be more interesting. But that would be creating entirely new utility for Roy. I'm struggling to say much about him because there simply isn't much he's done wrong, but there's not much he's done right neither.
Oh, but the hilt gimmick is entirely new utility. That wasn't from Fire Emblem.
That is true. It wasn't from Fire Emblem. It was an entirely new gimmick made for Smash. And it was created as an opposite to Marth's Tipper gimmick, which also wasn't from Fire Emblem. But I think if we need an opposite to Marth, I think Ike does a much better job in that regard. With Lucina, Chrom, and Roy gone, who's next? With those three gone, we've taken the Fire Emblem roster from 8 to 5. Ideally, this is where I would stop. But if you want me to keep going, Byleth would be my next pick. Byleth is fairly interesting. He uses a sword, a lance, an axe, and a bow. He's what Fire Emblem players like myself might call a weapons master. It's pretty cool to have a character represent the weapon triangle. If you're not in the loop, the weapon triangle is basically a system revolving around 3 types of weapons. You've got swords, which are weak against lances, which are weak against axes, which are weak against swords. It's sort of like Pokemon in that sense. Some weapons are colorless, so they don't fit within the weapon triangle. These are usually reserved for staffs and bows. Though that does depend on the Fire Emblem game. Sometimes staffs and bows can be red, green, blue, it doesn't matter. I think it's really ironic that Byleth represents the weapon triangle in Fire Emblem when that's not a thing in Fire Emblem Three Houses. It's been removed. I guess Sakurai just had to do something with Byleth that wasn't just regular Fire Emblem Swordy again, and he also wanted to use those other weapons because they kinda look cool. Thing is, the sword being able to be used as a whip was an interesting idea that Sakurai could have gone further with, but unfortunately, just like with Fire Emblem Three Houses, there's not much done with it. Thing is, no matter what Sakurai does with this character, I think that the 4 characters above him are better choices for Smash. So, after Byleth, who's the next character on my list? With 4 characters gone, and 4 characters left, I think many Smash players would be happy with the amount of Fire Emblem characters being halved, even if I think that cutting out only 3 was the better choice. But if I were to go further, well, here's Corrin. If you know anything about me, you know that I play Corrin, so you might be thinking I'm biased to have Corrin this high up. On top of that, Corrin was probably one of the most contentious characters back in Smash 4. There are a lot of people unhappy with Corrin's inclusion in that game. This issue is actually multi-layered though, and it's the reason why Corrin has more hate than any other Fire Emblem character in this game. Basically, Smash players thought that this 6th Fire Emblem character was when we started having too many Fire Emblem characters. And it didn't help that the animated introduction in the Corrin trailer was incredibly lazy. The animated intro was just an edited cutscene from Fire Emblem Fates. The rest of the trailer was okay though. On the other hand, Fire Emblem Fates had a lot of stigma within the Fire Emblem community. While the game did definitely sell quite well, the community became an echo chamber of people hating on the game for its lackluster story and lackluster characters, despite the amount of praise that it gets for its character designs, music, and concepts. No, seriously, this game has amazing music. Anyone who takes this game in good faith knows that this game's music was absolutely butchered in Smash. I mean, seriously, so much good music, and the only track from this game is the main theme. And there's 4 versions of it. 4! Now, other than that, I'm not really going to get into my opinions on Fates because while I am definitely biased towards that game, I don't want it to be the reason why I've got Corrin so high up on this list. So, why do I have Corrin so high up on this list? The main reason is, well, from the very beginning, like I said, Fire Emblem has been about swords, magic, and dragons. Corrin has a sword, has magic, and can turn into a dragon. Okay, sure, I mean like, it's not traditional magic, but doesn't turn into a dragon kind of constitute as magic? Also, Corrin can kinda just summon water and fire water attacks out of his hands. That's magic, come on. Anyways, coming up to Smash Ultimate's release, Corrin was the only Fire Emblem main protagonist that can actually shapeshift into a dragon. I've seen people say that Tiki should represent the dragon side of Fire Emblem, and this just doesn't work. First off, Tiki is a side character from Marth's games and is also featured in Awakening. Come on guys, a 4th character from Awakening? Secondly, Tiki isn't a main character like Corrin is. I think that out of every Fire Emblem protagonist, Corrin has a pretty unique role that plays into the dragon aspect of Fire Emblem. I think a bit of irony is that while Robin isn't considered a swordie by many, Corrin is. However, both Robin and Corrin use sword attacks with the A button, and some form of magic with the B button. In fact, Robin actually has more sword attacks in total than Corrin. Although to be fair, Corrin's sword attacks do have more reach than Robin's, and Robin's magic has more reach than Corrin's shapeshifting. Due to the extra reach, Corrin's sword attacks are a little bit more applicable than Robin's. I think the biggest issue with Corrin in this game is the fact that down B is just a counter, instead of allowing Corrin to actually use the dragon form effectively, like he can in Fire Emblem. You'll have Fire Emblem players tell me that they rarely use the dragon form in Fire Emblem, and, well, aside from the fact that it does give Corrin some additional utility in the game, it's not only very useful in the early game, but also, Roy is simply not an effective fighter in Fire Emblem, but he's very good in Smash. Why aren't Fire Emblem players complaining that Roy is actually a powerful fighter now? Or why aren't they complaining that Byleth can use 4 different weapons at once in Smash? Let's move on. With Lucina, Chrom, Roy, Byleth, and Corrin gone, who's next? We have Marth, Ike, and Robin left. This was actually quite difficult. Marth is the original Fire Emblem character, Ike is his heavyweight counterpart, and Robin is the magic wielder. From this trio of characters, I would say that Ike would have to go. Like I said before, Ike is the most popular Fire Emblem character of all time. He won a popularity poll back in 2021. That checks out, he's the first Fire Emblem character I ever drew back in Smash 4. I love him, he's great. As much as I think popularity is important, I think being a unique, interesting fighter is more important, which Robin is better at, being a magic wielder with a sword. Ike is my second favorite Fire Emblem character in this game behind Corrin, so I don't actually prefer Marth and Robin over him. In fact, out of every Fire Emblem character that I've ever played in Smash, Ike was the one that I played first. But I think he's just too simple, too basic. There needs to be something more interesting about Ike, and quite frankly, he doesn't have that much to work with. Now, people who like the Tellius games will tell me that I'm lying, and I mean, am I? He's definitely got stuff in Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn that aren't in Smash, but how much is there that's actually special? After Ike is Robin. Earlier, I said Fire Emblem is about swords, magic, and dragon. Well, without spoiling anything, Robin fills out the criteria for both sword and magic. I think Robin is the best representative of Fire Emblem, right underneath Marth. Of course Marth is at the very top of my list, where else would he be? The reason why Marth is at the very top of my list as the most important representative for Smash, well, it's pretty simple, he's the original Fire Emblem character, right? He's also the original swordie in Smash Bros. Yes, Link also uses swords, but he has an assortment of tools, whilst Marth only uses his sword. Marth was the basis for all swordies going forward, and for all of these reasons, I think he deserves a spot at the top of my list of most important Fire Emblem characters in Smash Ultimate. Now, do I think that the other characters on my list could be swapped around? Not really. There could possibly be things done to make these characters more interesting, but I don't think it would be enough. But let's do a little thinking exercise. What could be done about them? In Lucina's case, I don't know. Give her some unique sword swings, but I don't have much ideas for her. Chrom, on the other hand. Chrom is known for being headstrong. He's smarter than people give him credit for, but I'm sure he'd like to jump into battle. One of my problems with Chrom is, well, some of his attacks look too reserved for him. This is, of course, a result of him being based off of Roy, who was based off of Marth. So I think that some of Chrom's moves could get replaced with some more aggressive-looking animations. Let's take his Nair, for example. Doesn't this look like something that someone with a lot of finesse would have? I'm sure Chrom does have finesse, but I'm sure he'd also get lost in the heat of battle. Instead, we could make his Nair look a little bit more aggressive. I'm thinking something like Meta Knight Nair. As for Roy, let's do more with his fire, as I said before. Maybe his neutral B could be a little bit faster, with the explosion being a little bit bigger. That way, Roy players can use the neutral B a little bit more frequently, and it'll be a little bit more useful. Or maybe his forward smash could have some AoE explosion too. As for Byleth, well, with all 4 weapons, they've clearly decked out a lot for this character, so I'm not quite sure what else to do with Byleth. However, I did mention using the sword as a whip a little bit more, so how about his grab could be his sword turning into his whip and being used as an extended grab, sort of like Pac-Man's or Min-Min's. Then we've got Corrin. As I mentioned before, Corrin should be able to turn into a dragon and use that form effectively. The basic idea behind this is that Corrin's dragon form is slower and has less reach, but is harder to kill due to being heavier, and gets more kills due to being stronger. The biggest problem with this, of course, would be making the dragon model work, but I'm sure they could figure it out. Now, I've seen other Fire Emblem players say this, but Ike should be able to have his sword beams. Back in the Tellius games, Ike could use sword beams. Due to Ike already being known for having good area coverage where his sword is, how about having more area coverage where his sword isn't? I think it should work like Terry's neutral B. When used on the ground, it travels a good distance. But when used in the air, it's not much of a projectile, just an extended hitbox. I also think this move should be bigger than Terry's, but slower. As for Robin, one of his least used moves is his down B, Nosferatu. What they could have done with this move is give it more reach, so it looks a little bit closer to how it does in Fire Emblem. Just a little bit though, it doesn't need to cover the whole screen. And finally, we've got Marth. I've seen other players say this too, Marth should have his Fire Emblem. See, for those who don't know, every Fire Emblem main protagonist has their own Fire Emblem. Typically, it's their most powerful tool. Marth is the only Fire Emblem character in Smash who doesn't have his own Fire Emblem in-game. You'd think that his sword is his Fire Emblem, and while his sword is the same sword that Chrom and Lucina use and that's their Fire Emblem, that's because the sword's power was awakened, get it, by the power of the Binding Shield. The Binding Shield is actually Marth's Fire Emblem, and the energy of that Fire Emblem gets used to turn the sword into Chrom and Lucina's Fire Emblem. Does that make sense to you? No? Whatever, I don't care, just give Marth his shield. To finish off with a brief summary. Lucina's at the bottom because she's too derivative of Marth. Perhaps something could be done to give her new attacks to make her a little bit more unique, but she doesn't have much to work with, unfortunately. Additionally, out of the Awakening trio, I'd say she's probably the least important character. Chrom is in 7th place because he too is derivative. Out of Robin and Chrom, I'd say Robin is a better representative for Fire Emblem than Chrom is. Just like Lucina, Chrom doesn't really have much to work with, but some of his attacks could be changed to make him look a little bit more aggressive, making him slightly more unique. Roy is in 6th place because he also doesn't have that much to work with, and he's a bit derivative of Marth. Besides being fast like Chrom, I think the main reason people like Roy is the fact that he was the 2nd Fire Emblem protagonist to be added, all the way back in Melee. Maybe if a bit more was done with his whole fire property, then he'd be a bit more interesting. Byleth is in 5th place. While Byleth is interesting, he's our solid middle ground. The next 4 characters have traits that I'd say are more important. Byleth represents the franchise very well due to being from a popular game and wielding various types of weapons. But in this game, that just isn't as special as the next 4 characters. Corrin is 4th, because dragons are a big part of Fire Emblem, and he's the only Fire Emblem main protagonist that can fill this role. However, while his dragon abilities do differentiate him from the other swordies, more could be done to make him more special. A big example is allowing his dragon form to actually be playable. Ike is 3rd, because he's our heavyweight counterpart to Marth. While he isn't the only Fire Emblem main protagonist that can fill that role, he certainly is the most popular. Smash needs heavyweights to balance out the roster. Robin is second because he wields both swords and magic tomes, so there's a lot of potential with this character. Also, I believe he's the most important character from Awakening. Marth is first because, well, he's the root of Fire Emblem and the beginning of sword fighters in Smash. That's where I'll have to stop for today. This is my first attempt at a discussion video, so while I'm satisfied with the editing for now, I do acknowledge that the recording was at times a bit sloppy or awkward, but with time I'll get better at this sort of thing. That's been me. See you guys.